Have you ever driven down a quiet road at night, where the trees lean close over the pavement, the headlights barely cutting through the shadows, and every turn feels like it hides a secret? That sense of isolation can be haunting, but on Virginia's Colonial Parkway, it became something far darker. Between 1986 and 1989, this scenic road, known for its history and beauty, turned into the backdrop of one of America's most chilling unsolved mysteries. A series of murders that claimed the lives of young couples, shattering families and frightening an entire community. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive into history's most haunting cases, both solved and unsolved. Today, we are stepping into a story that blends the serene atmosphere of a national park with the terror of a cold-blooded killer or killers whose identity has evaded justice for nearly 4 decades. This is the story of the Colonial Parkway murders. To understand why these crimes struck such a deep chord, you have to picture the Colonial Parkway itself. It is not just any highway, it is a 23-mile stretch of road connecting historic sites like Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown. By day, it is a place of scenic drives, autumn leaves, and riverside views. But by night, it transforms: no streetlights, dense woods, and long stretches where you might not see another car for miles. For young couples in the 1980s, it was a place to talk, to park, to escape from the world. But it was also the perfect hunting ground for someone who knew how to strike in silence. And that is exactly what happened. The first known attack came in October 1986, when Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski were found murdered near their car. At first, people thought it might be an isolated crime, tragic, yes, but not necessarily the beginning of a nightmare. But over the next 3 years, more couples vanished or were killed under disturbingly similar circumstances. Each case added to the fear, the mystery, and the sense that someone was deliberately stalking this quiet stretch of Virginia. It was not just the brutality of the crimes that stunned investigators, it was the precision. Whoever was responsible seemed to know the area intimately, and in some cases, appeared to gain the trust of the victims before the attack. Some even speculated that the killer might have been impersonating law enforcement, stopping cars under the guise of authority. Imagine living in Virginia in the late 1980s and hearing about these crimes on the evening news. Parents warned their kids not to go driving on the parkway. Couples who once felt safe pulling over by the river now thought twice. Law enforcement agencies flooded the area with patrols, tips poured in, and families of victims demanded answers. The FBI, Virginia State Police, and local departments worked together in what became one of the most intensive investigations of its time. Thousands of leads were followed, dozens of suspects were considered, and yet, as months turned into years, no arrest came. The Colonial Parkway murders became a chilling reminder that even in a modern, well-connected community, a killer could hide in plain sight. What makes the Colonial Parkway murders so unsettling is not just the violence itself, but the mystery that still surrounds it. For decades, families were left without closure. Theories swirled: was it a single serial killer, methodical and careful, or were the murders the work of more than one person? Was the killer connected to law enforcement or the military, given the proximity of naval bases and training centers nearby? And most disturbing of all, why couples? The choice of victims seemed deliberate, almost symbolic. Was the killer targeting relationships, intimacy, or simply exploiting the vulnerability of young people looking for a quiet place to be alone? For nearly 40 years, the Colonial Parkway murders remained one of America's most notorious cold cases. But in 2024, a stunning development changed everything. DNA evidence identified a long-deceased man, Alan Wade Wilmer Sr., as a prime suspect in at least 2 of the murders. It was a breakthrough that finally gave some families a name and perhaps a measure of relief. And yet, the story is not over. Some murders in the series still have no confirmed link to Wilmer. Questions remain. Could there have been more than one killer? Are their victims still unaccounted for? And most importantly, why did it take so long for the truth to emerge? As we go deeper into this case in today's video, we are going to uncover each of the known attacks, the evidence investigators found, the theories that have dominated the conversation, and the shocking recent updates that have reopened old wounds while offering glimmers of closure. The Colonial Parkway murders remind us of a chilling reality. Sometimes the most beautiful places hide the darkest secrets. And sometimes, justice comes decades too late. So grab a seat, because this story is not just about crime, it is about history, mystery, and the long, painful road toward truth. And before we dive in, let me know in the comments, do you think the Colonial Parkway murders were the work of one serial killer? Or multiple offenders? Make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you do not miss the full breakdown of this haunting case. When we talk about the Colonial Parkway murders, it is impossible not to focus on the people at the heart of the story, the victims. These were not statistics or faceless names in an old police file. They were young men and women with families, dreams, and futures that were stolen from them in the most brutal way. Between 1986 and 1989, at least 4 couples fell prey to whoever was hunting along that lonely road, and each case deepened the mystery. The first known victims were Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski, 2 young women whose lives were full of promise. Kathy had served in the U.S. Navy and was known for her strong spirit, while Rebecca was a bright college student. They were last seen alive in October 1986. And their car was later found parked off the parkway. Inside and around the vehicle, investigators discovered evidence of a violent struggle. Their deaths were not just tragic, they set the tone for the fear that would soon grip Virginia. Almost a year later, in September 1987, tragedy struck again. David Knobling and Robin Edwards were last seen together before their bodies were discovered on the banks of the James River. David was only 20 years old, Robin just 14. Their ages shocked the public and intensified pressure on investigators. Unlike Kathy and Rebecca, whose deaths might have been seen as an isolated attack, David and Robin's murders confirmed something far more sinister was unfolding, a pattern. Then came the chilling disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in April 1988. They were last seen after attending a party. And their car was later found abandoned near the Colonial Parkway. This time, though, there were no bodies. Despite extensive searches of the area, Keith and Cassandra were never found. Their families were left in a limbo of grief and unanswered questions, making their case one of the most haunting in the series. The string of violence continued in September 1989, when Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer vanished while traveling together. Their car was found along Interstate 64, not far from the Colonial Parkway. Months later, their remains were discovered in a nearby wooded area. By this point, the pattern was undeniable: young couples, isolated locations, and sudden, unexplained death. Taken together, these victims represent more than just the horror of the crimes. They represent lives interrupted, families forever scarred, and communities that still carry the weight of unanswered questions. Each couple had their own story, their own plans for the future, and in each case, those futures ended violently along or near the parkway. As we move deeper into this story, it is important to remember that behind the theories, the suspects, and the forensic evidence are these individuals: Kathy and Rebecca, David and Robin, Keith and Cassandra, Anna Maria and Daniel. They are the reason investigators never stopped searching for answers. And the reason this case continues to capture public attention nearly 40 years later. To truly grasp the darkness of the Colonial Parkway murders, we have to understand the setting itself, the road where beauty and history collided with terror. The Colonial Parkway is unlike most highways in America. Stretching about 23 miles through Virginia, it connects Jamestown, Williamsburg, and Yorktown, 3 of the most important sites in the nation's early history. On paper, it was built as a peaceful scenic route, designed for visitors to drive slowly, enjoy the riverside views, and take in the rolling landscapes that whisper stories of America's colonial past. By day, it was a postcard of tranquility. By night, it was a trap. Unlike ordinary highways, the parkway was never designed for heavy traffic. There are no streetlights, no billboards, no bustling gas stations, and, crucially, very little surveillance. The road winds through thick forests, open marshes, and stretches of waterfront, creating an eerie sense of isolation once the sun goes down. At night, the darkness is absolute. Drivers often described it as a tunnel of black, where your headlights are the only thing keeping the void at bay. For young couples, it felt like a perfect place to escape the world for a while. For a predator, it offered the perfect stage to act unseen. What made the Colonial Parkway even more unnerving was its reputation as a lover's lane during the 1980s. Couples often parked along the scenic pull-offs or near the riverbanks to talk, listen to music, or simply be alone. These spots were quiet and beautiful, but they were also secluded. Far from help if anything went wrong. That seclusion gave the killer or killers both the time and the privacy to strike. In several cases, the victims' cars were discovered neatly parked, as though someone with authority had convinced them to pull over. This detail fueled the chilling theory that the murderer might have been impersonating law enforcement, using the trust people had in uniforms to disarm them before the attack. The parkway's geography also played a role in why the investigation became so difficult. Dense woods could conceal evidence for years, rivers could wash away crucial clues, and the lack of traffic meant that potential witnesses were few and far between. Even when vehicles were discovered quickly, the surrounding environment often worked against investigators. The natural beauty that made the parkway famous also made it a forensic nightmare. And there was another complicating factor. The parkway's proximity to military bases and naval installations. This meant the area was filled with service members, contractors, and transient populations who could easily come and go without drawing attention. Investigators had to sort through countless names, leads, and backgrounds, adding to the overwhelming complexity of the case. In short, the Colonial Parkway was not just the backdrop, it was almost a character in the story itself. Its haunting isolation, scenic pull-offs, and connection to both history and hidden danger created the perfect hunting ground for a predator. When we think about why these murders went unsolved for so long, the unique environment of this road plays a huge part in the answer. What made the Colonial Parkway murders especially disturbing was not only the number of victims but also the manner in which the attacks were carried out. Each scene carried signs of control, precision, and cold calculation, as if the killer was not simply lashing out in anger but following a method. Investigators soon realized that these crimes shared eerie similarities, suggesting a pattern that pointed to either one extremely careful offender or several individuals who thought in similar ways. One of the most consistent elements across the cases was the use of strangulation. Unlike a gun or a knife attack, strangulation is intensely personal. It requires physical contact, time, and strength. For investigators, this detail suggested that the murderer wanted more than just to kill, he wanted dominance, a direct assertion of control over his victims. In some cases, there were also cuts to the throat, adding another brutal layer to the violence. Another unsettling detail was how the vehicles were found. Often, the victims' cars were neatly parked in areas that did not immediately suggest a struggle. This gave rise to one of the most haunting theories, that the killer may have impersonated a law enforcement officer. On a dark, isolated road, it would not be unusual for young people to comply if someone with authority or the appearance of authority signaled for them to pull over. This theory explained why so many vehicles appeared orderly and why there were few obvious signs of forced entry or chaos inside. The absence of robbery was also telling. In most of the cases, personal belongings, wallets, and purses were left behind, sometimes untouched. That meant the motive was not financial gain but something more disturbing: a fixation, a compulsion, or simply the thrill of hunting human lives. Another shared element was the seclusion of the sites. The victims were attacked in areas where discovery would be delayed. Some bodies were hidden near riverbanks, others left in wooded areas, and in one case, the victims were never found at all. The environment itself helped conceal evidence, but the careful placement of vehicles and bodies made investigators think the killer was deliberately using the parkway's geography to his advantage. What haunted investigators the most was the sense of planning. These were not crimes of sudden opportunity. They seemed orchestrated. Whoever was responsible likely knew the road intimately, understood its blind spots, and had the confidence to operate without fear of being caught. That level of control suggested either someone with training, perhaps military or law enforcement experience, or someone who had spent a long time studying the area and waiting for the right moments to strike. The method of killing left behind more questions than answers. Was this one person carefully refining his tactics over time, or were there multiple killers, each adopting a similar style in a place where isolation made murder terrifyingly easy? The brutality and the precision ensured that, even decades later, the Colonial Parkway murders are remembered not just as crimes but as calculated performances of control, fear, and silence. When the first bodies were discovered along the Colonial Parkway, local authorities quickly realized they were facing something out of the ordinary. A double homicide in such a quiet area was shocking enough, but the brutality of the scene made it clear this was no random act of violence. Within hours, the case had escalated beyond the capacity of small-town police. The FBI, Virginia State Police, and local sheriff's departments joined forces, and the investigation became one of the largest collaborative efforts in the region's history. In the mid-1980s, joint task forces were less common than they are today, and coordinating between multiple agencies posed challenges. But the sheer horror of the crimes demanded it. Investigators fanned out along the parkway, combing wooded areas, riverbanks, and roadside pull-offs for clues. Dozens of officers searched on foot, boats patrolled the James and York rivers, and helicopters scanned the dense tree canopy from above. The scene looked more like a military operation than a police search. The FBI's involvement added an air of gravity to the case. Because the Colonial Parkway is federal property, the Bureau had jurisdiction, and that meant advanced resources, forensic labs, and behavioral profilers were pulled into the effort. Early on, the FBI's behavioral science unit suggested the murders bore the hallmarks of a serial offender, someone organized, confident, and comfortable operating in isolation. This theory both terrified the public and intensified media attention. As weeks turned into months, pressure grew on law enforcement. Reporters filled newspapers and television broadcasts with details about the victims and speculation about the killer. Families of the murdered couples demanded answers. Citizens called in thousands of tips, convinced they had seen something suspicious or knew someone capable of such acts. The investigation ballooned under the weight of possibility, yet no single lead brought them closer to a suspect. The lack of witnesses frustrated investigators. Unlike crimes committed in cities or suburbs, the Colonial Parkway offered almost no casual bystanders who might have seen a vehicle, a stranger, or a suspicious figure. The killer seemed to vanish into the darkness after each attack, leaving behind only bodies, abandoned cars, and fragments of terror. Even the physical evidence was limited. While forensic science was improving during the 1980s, it was not yet at the level where trace DNA could easily solve cold cases. Fibers, fingerprints, and other materials were collected, but none produced a breakthrough. The community, meanwhile, lived in fear. Parents warned their children never to drive the parkway at night. Couples who once enjoyed the quiet pull-offs now avoided them altogether. Patrol cars lined the road, their flashing lights meant to deter the killer but also serving as a grim reminder of the danger. Residents began to wonder if the murderer might be someone they knew, a neighbor, a coworker, or even someone wearing a badge. Despite the intense pressure, law enforcement never abandoned the case. Files grew thicker. Interviews piled up, and every new crime scene brought renewed urgency. But as the years passed without an arrest, the investigation shifted from being a breaking news story to a haunting cold case. For many in Virginia, the question remained, how could so many resources, so many brilliant minds, and so much determination still failed to catch whoever was preying on young couples along the Colonial Parkway. As the years went by and no arrests were made, theories began to multiply. With every unanswered question, the public, the media, and even investigators themselves tried to piece together the identity and motives of the Colonial Parkway killer. Some theories sounded plausible, grounded in evidence, while others drifted into speculation, but all reflected the frustration of a community desperate for answers. The most widely accepted idea was that the murders were the work of a single serial killer. The similarities between the case's young couples, isolated locations, vehicles neatly parked, and methods of strangulation or throat injury suggested a consistent pattern. Profilers from the FBI believed the killer was organized, intelligent, and likely familiar with law enforcement tactics. He seemed to know how to control his victims without leaving much evidence behind. To many, this pointed to someone who had training. Someone who had thought carefully about how to commit crimes and avoid detection. Another chilling theory was that the killer had been impersonating a police officer. Several details supported this idea: the way cars were parked without signs of forced entry, the lack of defensive wounds in some victims, and the trust victims appeared to show before being attacked. On a dark and lonely road, if a uniformed figure or flashing light signaled you to pull over, you would likely comply without question. This theory struck fear deep into the community, because it suggested not just a predator, but someone exploiting the very symbols of safety and authority. A third theory was that there might have been multiple killers rather than just one. Some investigators pointed out differences between the cases: certain victims were left near rivers, others in wooded areas. And the exact methods of killing were not always identical. Could it have been two or more offenders using the parkway as a hunting ground, or perhaps a copycat inspired by the first murders, seeking to exploit the climate of fear? While less popular, this theory lingered because not all details fit neatly into a single narrative. The parkway's proximity to military and naval bases added another layer of suspicion. Thousands of service members and contractors moved in and out of the region, many of them familiar with survival skills, discipline, and procedures that might make them more capable of committing controlled, calculated crimes. The transient nature of military life also meant suspects could come and go, making it harder for investigators to track patterns. Some even speculated the killer could have been a Navy man. Perhaps someone who lived and worked just miles from the crime scenes. And then there were those who believed the Colonial Parkway murders might not be fully connected at all, that perhaps some of the killings were related, while others were coincidental but shared similar circumstances. This theory offered little comfort, though, because whether it was one killer or several, the fact remained: young couples were being targeted. And no one was safe. In the end, these theories revealed more about the fear of the time than about the killer's true identity. Each possibility: a lone serial predator, a corrupt authority figure, a group of offenders, or a military connection, added to the legend of the case. And with every year that passed without answers, the Colonial Parkway murders grew into something larger than crime itself. A mystery that captured the imagination and the terror of an entire generation. As the 1990s arrived and the Colonial Parkway grew busier with tourists and commuters, the murders faded from daily headlines but never from the minds of those directly affected. For the families of the victims, the silence from law enforcement was unbearable. Each year that passed without an arrest was another reminder that justice had slipped away. What had begun as one of the most high-profile investigations in Virginia gradually transformed into a cold case, a haunting puzzle stored in filing cabinets, revisited only when anniversaries or new tips emerged. The lack of resolution turned the Colonial Parkway murders into a legend of American true crime. Writers, documentary filmmakers, and crime enthusiasts pointed to the case as a symbol of how even the most intense investigations could stall. It stood alongside the Zodiac Killer in California, the Long Island serial killer in New York, and other infamous mysteries as proof that some predators could outwit even the most determined detectives. For the public, the Parkway itself became a place of ghost stories. Locals whispered warnings not to drive it at night. Parents told their children to avoid the pull-offs that once felt safe for young couples. The murders became part of Virginia folklore, retold in classrooms, crime magazines, and television specials. The scenic drive, once advertised for its beauty, now carried a chilling reputation. Beneath the quiet trees and historic charm lay unsolved bloodshed. The families of victims worked tirelessly to keep the case alive. They gave interviews, organized memorials, and begged the authorities not to let the files gather dust. For them, closure meant more than simply finding a suspect. It meant restoring the dignity of their loved ones, whose lives had been reduced to entries in unsolved casebooks. Every holiday season, every anniversary of a disappearance, reopened wounds. Parents grew old without answers, siblings carried grief into adulthood, and communities continued to wonder if the killer was still walking among them. Meanwhile, investigators were not completely idle. The FBI and state police occasionally revisited evidence, hoping that advances in forensic science might succeed where older methods had failed. DNA testing was in its infancy in the late 1980s, but by the early 2000s, it became a beacon of hope. Samples once too degraded or too small to analyze were now re-examined with cutting-edge technology. Still, year after year, no public breakthroughs came, and frustration deepened. By the 2010s, the Colonial Parkway murders had achieved near-mythical status in the world of true crime. Podcasts, books, and online forums debated theories late into the night. Amateur sleuths pored over crime scene details, convinced they could solve what the FBI could not. Yet with all the speculation, the central fact remained: 8 young lives were gone. And whoever had taken them had never been held accountable. The weight of decades without answers only magnified the mystery. Each year of silence added to the aura of invincibility surrounding the unknown killer. Had he died without ever facing justice? Had he blended back into society, undetected, or was he someone still living in Virginia, quietly watching as his crimes turned into legend, for nearly 40 years? Those questions kept the Colonial Parkway murders firmly lodged in the list of America's most haunting unsolved cases. After decades of frustration, hope finally emerged in early 2024. What once felt like a mystery locked in the past suddenly cracked open thanks to the power of modern forensic science. Investigators announced that they had made a DNA match linking a long-deceased man named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. to at least 2 of the Colonial Parkway murders. For the families, it was a moment that blended relief, sorrow, and anger all at once. Relief that a name had finally surfaced, sorrow that the suspect was already dead and could never face trial, and anger that it had taken nearly 40 years for this connection to be made. Wilmer was not a stranger to the area. He had lived in Virginia, near the very stretches of road where couples vanished. At the time of the murders, he was in his 30s, and people who knew him later described him as troubled, sometimes volatile, and occasionally violent. Still, he had never been convicted of crimes that would have placed his DNA into CODIS, the National Forensic Database. That technical gap meant his genetic profile sat outside the reach of investigators for decades. Only after new testing methods and genealogical tracing were used did his DNA finally match samples collected from the Colonial Parkway crime scenes. The confirmed matches tied Wilmer directly to the 1987 murders of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, as well as the 1989 killing of Teresa Lynn Spa Howell. For years, these cases had lingered as part of the wider mystery, with little more than circumstantial evidence to suggest any leads. Now, for the first time, science had placed a specific individual at the scenes. This was not speculation, not a vague theory, but a hard forensic link. The announcement shook the community. News outlets across the country picked up the story, framing it as a long-awaited breakthrough in one of America's most enduring cold cases. For the families, it was bittersweet. On one hand, there was validation: their loved ones had not been forgotten, and investigators had finally delivered answers. On the other hand, Wilmer's death in 2017 meant there would be no confession, no trial, and no opportunity to hear him explain why he did what he did. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never come. Authorities were careful in their wording. While DNA proved Wilmer's guilt in at least 2 murders, they stopped short of declaring him responsible for the entire Colonial Parkway series. Other cases, including the very first double murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986 and the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in 1988, remained unresolved. Still, the identification of Wilmer gave investigators a new framework. They began retracing his history, examining his associates, and searching for evidence that might tie him to the other victims. For many observers, the 2024 development was a turning point. It showed that even the coldest cases could thaw with persistence and science. But it also highlighted the cruel reality of time. By the moment the truth came out, the man behind at least some of the murders was already gone, and the chance to hold him accountable had died with him. When investigators publicly named Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. as a suspect in 2024, they did not make vague claims or rely on speculation. Instead, they pointed to specific cases where forensic science had delivered undeniable proof. For families who had waited decades, these announcements brought long-sought validation. Finally, there was a clear answer as to who had taken their loved ones. The first confirmed link was the case of David Knobling and Robin Edwards, who vanished in September 1987. David, 20 years old, was a hardworking young man with a reputation for being protective of his family. Robin, just 14, was full of energy and still finding her way in life. Their bodies were discovered along the banks of the James River, and from the start, the case baffled investigators. Their ages did not seem to match the pattern of older teenage or young adult couples, yet the circumstances echoed the Parkway murders: a parked vehicle, sudden disappearance, and violent end. For decades, their deaths were remembered with pain but little clarity. That changed in 2024, when DNA testing directly tied Wilmer to their murders. For David and Robin's families, the discovery confirmed what they had long suspected, that their children had been victims of the same predator who haunted the Parkway. The second confirmed link was to Teresa Lynn Spa Howell, murdered in 1989. Teresa's case had always carried eerie similarities to the others. She was young, vibrant, and her life was cut short under violent circumstances near the Parkway. For years, her murder lingered in the background of the investigation, overshadowed by the higher-profile double homicides. But in 2024, investigators announced that DNA evidence also placed Wilmer at her crime scene. That revelation not only gave Teresa's family a measure of closure but also expanded the timeline of Wilmer's crimes, showing that he had been active longer than many realized. These confirmed links did more than just tie Wilmer to individual victims. They painted a larger picture of his methods and consistency. In both cases, the victims were vulnerable, isolated, and attacked in settings where help would not arrive in time. The careful placement of vehicles, the lack of theft, and the brutality of the murders all matched the broader pattern of the Colonial Parkway series. Investigators could now say with confidence that Wilmer was not a random suspect or a scapegoat but a man whose genetic material placed him directly in the heart of the crimes. Yet even with these confirmations, the victories were bittersweet. Because Wilmer had died in 2017, there would be no interrogation, no courtroom testimony, and no chance for him to answer the families directly. The evidence was conclusive, but the justice system was powerless to deliver the accountability the victims deserved. For the public, the confirmed links solidified the idea that the Colonial Parkway murders were not just rumors or legends, they were real, and now science had named one of the men behind them. Even after DNA confirmed Alan Wade Wilmer Sr.'s guilt in 2 of the Colonial Parkway cases, investigators were careful to point out that other murders in the series remained unconfirmed. Still, the possibility that Wilmer was connected to them has fueled both hope and debate. Among the most haunting of these is the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in April 1988. Keith and Cassandra were last seen leaving a college party. Friends assumed they were heading home, but their car was later discovered abandoned along the Colonial Parkway. Inside were personal items, but no sign of a struggle. Unlike other cases, however, there were no bodies. To this day, their remains have never been found. For the families, that absence has been unbearable, living for decades without knowing what happened, without even a grave to visit. Investigators have long suspected that Keith and Cassandra fell victim to the same predator who killed along the parkway, and Wilmer's timeline fits. Yet without DNA, physical evidence, or remains, the link remains a strong suspicion rather than a proven fact. Another case often mentioned in connection with Wilmer is the double murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski in 1986, the first recognized Parkway killings. Both women were found inside their car near the York River, their throats cut, their lives ended in a manner consistent with the later murders. This case carried many of the same hallmarks. A couple targeted at night, a vehicle parked in a secluded area, and brutality that seemed both personal and calculated. Investigators have considered Wilmer a potential suspect here too, but again, the lack of usable DNA has kept the case in limbo. There is also speculation around the deaths of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer, who vanished in 1989 while driving near the parkway. Their car was found on an exit ramp, and their remains were discovered months later in the woods. Though the circumstances echoed other cases, investigators could not prove Wilmer's involvement. Some experts even question whether their deaths were truly part of the Parkway series or a separate tragedy that happened to occur in the same region. These unresolved cases highlight the frustrating reality of cold case investigations. DNA can work miracles when preserved samples exist. But in cases where evidence has degraded, bodies remain missing, or crime scenes were compromised decades ago, certainty is elusive. That is why Keith and Cassandra's disappearance remains one of the most haunting threads in the Colonial Parkway mystery. Without remains, every theory is a shadow. Without DNA, every suspicion remains a question mark. Still, investigators continue to re-examine evidence with new technology. And families hold out hope that one day they will know for sure whether Wilmer was responsible for all the deaths along the parkway or whether another figure, still unnamed, shared responsibility. Until then, the possible connections remain suspended between fact and speculation, reminders of how much truth can still be hidden even after decades of searching. Even with DNA evidence naming Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. as the killer in some of the Colonial Parkway cases, not every crime in the series has been tied to him. Several remain stubbornly unresolved, raising the possibility that more than one predator stalked Virginia during those years, or that some of the tragedies once grouped under the Colonial Parkway murders banner may not have been connected at all. The most prominent unresolved case is the 1986 double murder of Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski. Their deaths marked the beginning of the Parkway nightmare, yet Wilmer has not been conclusively linked to them. Kathy and Rebecca were found inside Kathy's car, which had been pushed down an embankment. Their throats had been cut, and the brutality of the crime suggested rage as well as control. The use of ligatures and the staging of the vehicle bore similarities to later killings, but the lack of usable DNA has prevented investigators from drawing a firm line between Wilmer and this crime. For some experts, the differences in method raise the uncomfortable possibility that Kathy and Rebecca may have fallen victim to a different killer entirely. Another lingering mystery is the 1989 disappearance and deaths of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer. Their car was discovered on a highway exit ramp, and their remains were found months later in a wooded area not far away. Unlike some of the other Parkway victims, their case carried details that did not fully match the established pattern. Some investigators suspected they had been hitchhiking or that their deaths might have been related to personal acquaintances. Others continued to group their case with the Parkway murders because of geography and timing. But with no DNA to link Wilmer and no definitive evidence pointing elsewhere, their story sits in an unresolved gray area. Then, of course, there is the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in 1988, which remains one of the most haunting gaps in the series. While some believe Wilmer was responsible, the absence of bodies makes this case uniquely difficult. Unlike the others, there is no crime scene that can be revisited, no physical remains to analyze, only a car and a void where answers should be. Decades later, their families still live in painful uncertainty. The unresolved cases leave investigators and families with a troubling dilemma. Was Wilmer the Colonial Parkway killer, responsible for every one of the murders and disappearances, or did he account for only part of the puzzle, leaving other victims tied to a different hand? The inconsistencies between cases, different methods, different locations, different victim profiles suggest that the truth may be more complex than the single killer narrative once believed. For now, these unresolved cases keep the Colonial Parkway murders shrouded in mystery. They remind us that even when science delivers breakthroughs, some questions refuse to be answered quickly. Until more evidence surfaces, Kathy and Rebecca, Anna Maria and Daniel, Keith and Cassandra remain caught between fact and speculation. Their stories still waiting for closure nearly 40 years later. As of 2025, the Colonial Parkway murders remain one of America's most haunting cases, partially solved, yet still carrying the weight of unanswered questions. The breakthrough in 2024, which identified Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. through DNA, gave families and investigators a name after decades of silence. It proved that persistence and science could crack open even the coldest of files. But while that development was historic, it was not the final chapter. Wilmer's confirmed role in the murders of David Knobling, Robin Edwards, and Teresa Lynn Spa Howell showed that at least part of the mystery had been solved. His death in 2017, however, left an empty space where accountability should have been. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no chance for him to speak about his crimes or reveal whether he was responsible for more. For the families of those victims, closure was bittersweet. They finally had a name, but no justice in the courtroom. Meanwhile, the other cases remain unresolved. Kathy Thomas and Rebecca Dowski's murders, the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley, and the deaths of Anna Maria Phelps and Daniel Lauer are all still without definitive answers. Investigators continue to test old evidence with new methods, hoping to extract DNA where previous technology failed. The possibility that Wilmer was involved in all of them remains on the table, but without conclusive proof, the cases cannot be declared solved. For the families still waiting, the frustration lingers. Law enforcement today emphasizes that the investigation is ongoing. Virginia State Police and the FBI have stated publicly that they continue to re-examine evidence and follow new leads. Cold case detectives, aided by advances in genetic genealogy and forensic analysis, still believe that further answers are possible. In the last few years, breakthroughs in other decades-old cases across the United States have renewed optimism that even the missing pieces of the Colonial Parkway puzzle might one day be found. Public interest remains high. Documentaries, podcasts, and news specials keep the story alive, ensuring that the victims are not forgotten. The Colonial Parkway itself, once a scenic route celebrated for its beauty, has become an uneasy landmark, a place where history and horror overlap. Every anniversary of the murders brings renewed calls for answers, and the families of the victims continue to push for updates, determined that their loved ones will not fade into the background of unsolved history. The current status of the case reflects both progress and limits. Progress, because science has delivered a name where once there was only speculation. Limits, because death has shielded the suspect from facing justice, and gaps in evidence prevent the full story from being told. As of 2025, the Colonial Parkway murders stand as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, a caution that some killers may never face trial, and a hope that persistence and technology can still bring truth to light, even decades later. In the end, the Colonial Parkway murders stand as a haunting reminder that even the most beautiful places can conceal darkness. For nearly 40 years, families have lived with grief, investigators have chased shadows, and communities have carried the weight of fear and unanswered questions. The breakthrough of 2024 finally gave names and answers to some of those wounds, but others remain open, waiting for the truth. Perhaps one day, every victim's story will be fully told, and the Parkway will no longer echo with mystery. Until then, this case reminds us of both the fragility of life and the enduring strength of those who refuse to give up on justice. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of America's most unsettling cold cases. If you found this story compelling, do not forget to like the video. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you will never miss our deep dives into history's greatest mysteries. And before you go, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Alan Wade Wilmer Sr. was responsible for all the Colonial Parkway murders, or could there still be another figure hiding in the shadows? Your perspective matters, and I would love to hear it. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious. And remember, the past is never as far away as it seems.